When making accessory items for IMVU that are going to include a pose, so basically a posed accessory, when building the accessory mesh, we want to be using the clothing tool because we need access to the same skeletal structure as is used by the animation tool, the pose tool. We can't use the attachment tool in this context because the skeleton, the underlying structure for the attachments, is very different to something that needs to have access to poses. So build your item in the clothing tool. So let's say we've got this phone mesh here. We've built it in situ. We can hide the avatar, select the armature and hide that. So we can build relative to the grid. Once we've got the mesh sorted out, all we need to do is position that relative to where it needs to be. So in this case, the hand. Which can be a little tricky depending on the angle, the pose, how the item is going to be used. Like so. So that's step one, or step two, aside from building the mesh. So build the mesh, then step two is positioning it where it needs to be. Step three, so once we've got our mesh positioned where it wants to be, we want to use in this instance the RT hand bone. So we need to select our mesh, modifiers. We don't need that. That's a smoothing modifier. We don't need that for this mesh. Add deform armature. We want to do it this way rather than what we might ordinarily do, which is bind to armature, because we don't want to include vertex groups. We'll see this in a second. This will assign vertex groups for every bone in the skeleton to our mesh. We want to avoid doing that, so we can do this manually. So mesh, add modifiers, deform armature. Add that. Select the object, which is the skeleton or the rig. That's step 3. Step 4, object data properties. We want to be in vertex groups. Create a new vertex group. Double click, rename this the name of the bone that we're using to influence or attach our object to. So in this case, that's RT hand, uppercase H, case sensitive, so it has to match exactly. Edit mode. We need to make sure now that that vertex group, so select all, is assigned to every vertex of the mesh. So we've got these buttons now. Click on assign. Quick test. That's okay. What we should find, if we toggle back into object mode, select the armature, toggle that into pose mode, and do a quick test. Select one of the bones and move it, and the phone, in this case the mesh, should move with our armature. Back into object mode, save the file. File, save as. Clothing. Once we've got that, we just need to export. So we need to just double check that our mesh is inside the clothing export collection. If it's not, we can select it, object, collection. So object collection, move to collection. So the shortcut key for that is M for Marty. And we want that in clothing scene, clothing export. That will shift it into place. so we can then export. We need to save the file first before we do, then just click on export. So that's exported our mesh. Once we've got this, we can transfer the mesh into a pose project. We can then use this as the basis to create our pose. So all we need to do for that is select our object, copy objects. That's copied it. File, new, general, don't save. Animation tool. So add an animation tool instance. So we've got the female. And then all we need to do, object, paste. And this will drop in both our mesh and the linked skeleton. We don't need this, so we can select it and just delete. That will remove it. So now, once we've got rid of that, we then set up the mesh with respect to the rig, the skeleton that we need to use for posing. And to do that, we can use, so select our mesh, and again, we want to be in modifiers. We can use the modifier, the armature modifier that was brought in with our mesh. So this is a carryover from the clothing tool setup. So all we need to do here is change the object. So click on the box, browse to, and for this we want anim. So make sure that's the one that's selected. The mesh will snap to the position it was set at in the clothing file. And once that's done, we can now, let's just save the file, save as, phone plus pose, save as. We can pose the avatar. So let's just enable auto key, switch to pose mode, and then just do a quick pose so that we can see how this works. And that will be our quick pose. We'll rename this, rename the sequence, so phone.pose. That's just so that we know what we're exporting or what we're dealing with in IMVU. Enable single user, so click the shield, save over the file. We need to save the file before we export. This is going to be a pose, so make pose. Leave the other options as is, and then we can export. And that will export the pose. It won't include the phone because we don't need to include that. It's just going to export the pose data, which is the rig. So all we need to do now is bring in both FBX files that we've now exported, both of those into Studio. So in Studio, now that we have our two files, we want to derive a product as normal. And in this instance, we want the female empties. So we're using the clothing derivable, not the accessories. We don't want that. We want clothing. So select, derive, and then we load in the two FBX files. The order isn't necessarily important, but we can bring in the pose first just to make sure that that works. This is what it's found in the file. Set up FBX. So we don't need the skeleton, we don't need the mesh, and we don't need to override anything. So disable all of those. Next, we don't need any materials because this is just going to be bringing in the pose data. The FBX essentially includes all the avatar meshes, the body parts, and the textures that are associated with that. We don't need those, so we can deselect and ignore them. And here we only want one of these. In this case, we want the skeletal pose. Although we did include some morph data, we didn't export a morph animation, so we didn't include a face animation. So we can deselect those, review. So that's all it's going to bring in, is just the pose, import. So now we want to be in component, action, new action. So this is the same process as setting up a pose as we would normally do. Set this trigger to stance dot standing if we want the pose to auto trigger when the avatar is standing. New ensemble. And we should have in skeletal animation, click on the list, our action sequence, and there it is. So add that. Let's just set this to 0 just to loop it infinitely. We'll set everything else up once we've applied this and tested. So preview, and there is our pose. So all we need to do now is configure this, click on the ellipses or the 3 dots, configure, and set this to frame 1, start, frame 2, end. Everything else is okay. Preview, and there is our pose. So we can also set this up to trigger with a word. So if we change that to phone, apply or preview, the pose will do the defaults until triggers, derivable, click on phone, and there is our pose. So all we need to do now is import the FBX for the mesh. Same process again. So this time we're importing the clothing version. Open. That's what it's found in the file. Setup FBX. So here, because we are deriving from a clothing avatar, we need to set a random mesh ID, otherwise we will inadvertently. So if we use the normal mesh IDs for accessories, attachments, 0 and 2, we can see that we would be overriding the torso and the head of whatever avatar, whether it's the male or the female avatar. So we need to set a random mesh ID. We don't need the skeleton that's coming in. We don't need to override any meshes. There isn't anything to override, so we can deselect that. Next. There are all our materials. Next. We don't need the clothing tool test animation, so we can deselect. Review, that's what it's going to bring in. Import, and our phone should appear in the hand. And then if we click on the trigger to activate it, there is the phone in the avatar's hand. So that is an accessory with pose. So the key to making sure that this works, in Blender, we need to make sure that we are using the clothing file and that our object is set up with respect to the default skeleton associated with clothing. Then we copy the accessory mesh across to an animation tool project. And then once we've got the pose set up and the accessory item set up, we export them in their respective files. We then end up with 2 FBX files, which we then bring in to Studio.